Talk. My name is Würschinger, and this is joint work with Barbara McGillivray and Hans-Jörg Schmid, and we're from LMU Munich and Cambridge University. And our talk is titled Social Semantic Variation of English COVID-related Neologisms. So we want to study words that are new because they've changed in meaning, and we also want to study whether there are social differences with regard to the use of these new words. As you all know, the coronavirus pandemic has triggered a lot of lexical innovation. You can see one list of a couple of COVID-related neologisms here, and you're probably familiar with at least some of them. However, these are all formal neologisms. And the focus of this talk will not be on formal neologisms, but on semantic ones. Another example of a COVID-related neologism is the word frontline. And in contrast to the previous examples, frontline isn't really new. This form has existed for a long time. But as the OED says, before 2020, we have this one meaning here of a person working at the forefront of an organization's public activity, typically as the point of direct contact with customers, clients, users of the organization's services, etc. And then this same form has received a pretty different meaning later on after the pandemic. So the OED says that in and after 2020, the meaning is often related to employees who provide a service regarded as vital within the community, such as a healthcare worker, teacher, etc., often in frontline worker. So clearly, this is a different kind of lexical innovation. We're not dealing with new forms, but we're dealing with new meanings or semantic neologisms. And these are the kinds of lexical innovation we are focusing on in this talk. Now, when we use one of the corpora I just mentioned already, the COCA or the coronavirus corpus, and we look into the meaning of frontline by using collocation analysis, this is what we get. So on the left-hand side, you get the results from COCA, which are pre-pandemic. And as you can see, the by far most strongly associated word is the word worker. And this is clear from the collocation frontline worker. But if we look at the other collocates of this word, we can see that we have a pretty diverse set of words with some focus on the domain of war, like troop, war, soldier, etc. Now, if we compare this to the post-pandemic list of collocates, we can see that again, workers, the plural of worker is on top. So this is still the by far most strongly associated word. But then the rest of the picture has changed quite significantly. So we don't really find any war words here anymore, but rather we have a strong focus on the health domain. And also we find the adjective essential, which was reflected in the second definition of the OED I showed you in the previous slide as well. Now, one method that goes beyond collocation analysis are so-called word embeddings. So the basic idea is the same, namely that you try to model the meaning of words by the kinds of words they occur with. I will talk a little bit more about how exactly this works later. We want to use the same method of word embeddings and try to figure out whether we can find words that have changed between 2019 and 2020, and whether the words that have changed the most between those 2 years are actually COVID-related, or whether we find other interesting semantic neologisms. So we basically have two research questions. The first is what I just described. Can we detect COVID-related semantic neologisms? The question is whether we actually find social semantic variation among these semantic neologisms. So do certain COVID-related neologisms differ between communities? Now, how do we collect all of this data? So fortunately, the Reddit data is freely available, and Jason Baumgartner hosts the full data set, which is more than 1 terabyte of textual data in size, on his website called PushShift. And there's a Python library called PSAR, which allows you to use an API to retrieve that data. And this is what we did. And for our study setup, as you will see, we need 3 data sets. So for the first research question, where we try to identify semantic neologisms, we need a data set that covers 2 time periods, 2019 and 2020, in order to compare the meaning of all words in our vocabulary between those 2 years, and in order to find the words that have changed the most between the 2 years. Now, this is the first data set. The second data set is for studying social semantic variation. So what we want to find out here is, as I said, do meanings of new words differ between communities? So in the first step, we need to know which are the communities that are particularly active and relevant with regard to the pandemic. And to find these most interesting subreddits, we use a query-based approach, and we retrieve a large set of comments that all contain the term COVID. This is the first step. And once we've determined certain subreddits that are of particular interest potentially to us. We then collect a bunch of subreddit-specific data sets where we download all the comments we can get for these subreddits. And for the community-based subreddits, we are focusing on 3 different subreddits in this talk. So there's one representative of the so-called mainstream. This is a subreddit coronavirus. And then there are the skeptics. And we have 2 representatives here, the subreddit conspiracy and the subreddit lockdown skepticism. So here's just a brief summary of the data sets. So for the semantic change detection, we have about a bit more than 5 million comments for both 2019 and 2020, which amounts to about 180 million running words. Then for the analysis, where we try to figure out which are the most relevant subreddits to study COVID, we've collected about 4 million comments. And lastly, for the social semantic variation, we've collected about 3 million comments from the subreddit coronavirus, 400,000 from lockdown skepticism, and 3 million from the subreddit conspiracy. Now, how do we conduct our analysis, and what kind of analysis is this? How can we embed new words? So how can we form meaning representations of words in a quantitative way? So the most important foundation for this is the notion of distributional semantics. So you can know a word by the company it keeps. You can model the meaning of words by looking into which words they occur with. In the end, if everything works, similar words should appear closely aligned in the vector space, and words that are more dissimilar should be more distant. Now, how do we arrive at these semantic representations? So first, as always, we need to do a couple of pre-processing steps. And then we train our word embeddings, and we use the very popular word-to-vec algorithm for that. After training several models, so for example, when we compare the semantic representations of 2019 of certain words to those of 2020, we need to align the word embedding model so that the vector spaces are aligned and we can actually measure distances meaningfully. And we use the popular orthogonal Procrustes method for this. And in the last step, when we have the embeddings, we evaluate them and we see whether words differ in meaning between 2 corpus slices, basically. So the next section will deal with the semantic change detection component, and I will show you the results right away. So what you can see here is a list of the words that our models identified as showing the biggest semantic distance between the years 2019 and 2020. And we were happy to see that the word corona ended up on the very top of the list. And we also find a couple of other COVID-related words, as you can see. For example, we have pandemic in position 6, distancing, lockdown, quarantine, and tracing. But there are also a couple of other interesting words that are supposed to have changed in meaning. For example, we can see Floyd, which is clearly a reflection of the George Floyd incident. And we find certain words related to social network platforms, namely Snapchat, like Snapchatting and gay Snapchat. But overall, this is sort of the results for the first research question. So it seems that we can detect certain semantic neologisms that have changed in meaning between 2019 and 2020. Now, what I showed you on the previous slide were the 20 words that were predicted to have changed the most between 2019 and 2020. And I forgot to mention, actually, to say a little bit more about this second column here, SEMDIST, which stands for semantic distance. So this is a measure of cosine distance that I introduced very briefly earlier. So this is the distance measure we can derive mathematically to measure the distance between semantic representations. So higher values here mean that the words are more distant semantically. If we go down the list, the values decrease. With this list here, I didn't just pick the top 20, but I went through the whole top 100 and picked out the ones that seem to be COVID related. And as you can see, we don't only have the ones I showed you earlier. So this is up until including tracing, but we have a bunch of other words related to masks, even Zoom, as in Zoom fatigue, which I showed you earlier. Now we can zoom in a little bit more and investigate what's behind these semantic representations. Namely, we can output the words that are most similar in meaning according to the model with regard to certain words we pick. So here I show you a case study for the word distancing, which was on the previous list. And the results for the 2019 model are on the left. So the words that are most similar to the word distancing in 2019 are distanced, disassociate, detaching, etc. So this is a pretty general and diverse list, I would say. And if we compare this to the nearest neighbors in 2020, we can see that the second list here is clearly dominated by the pandemic. So distancing in 2020 is closely related to isolation, to the lockdowns, to mass quarantine, etc. And this is kind of what we would expect to find. So this nearest neighbors method allows us to look into what kind of meaning change certain words have undergone. Now to our second research question. So we didn't only want to detect semantic change over time, but we also want to study social variation. So as I indicated earlier, first of all, we wanted to find out which communities we should compare because they're most relevant to COVID on Reddit. And therefore, we retrieved a big data set of comments that all contain the term COVID. So this is essentially a random sample of COVID-related comments on Reddit. And if we analyze which subreddits are most active with regard to the term COVID, we find that, unsurprisingly, probably coronavirus ends up on top, followed by very, very popular subreddits, but general ones like Ask Reddit, Politics, and World News. But then we also find a couple of subreddits that are interesting because they're probably less mainstream, like conspiracy here and lockdown skepticism. So this is how we pick the subreddits for the social variation analysis. We tried to pick one neutral subreddit, coronavirus, and then we also picked two subreddits that might show different semantic representations. Now, to give you an idea of what the differences between these subreddits might be, as you can see, coronavirus is a pretty serious subreddit and it's pretty neutral, whereas on the other hand, lockdown skepticism is clearly an activist subreddit with an agenda. So you would expect people to have different attitudes towards lockdown when comparing both subreddits. And the question is, will that be reflected in the meaning of the words? So what you can see here now is the nearest semantic neighbors analysis for the term lockdown between the two subreddits. So now I'm not comparing over time, but I'm trying to find out which words are closest in meaning in the respective communities to the word lockdown. And again, if we look at the representations in the neutral subreddit coronavirus, we have pretty neutral terms here: shutdown, lockdown, shutdowns, etc. And if we look at the right side, and we look at the nearest neighbors in the community lockdown skepticism, we have the same couple of terms on top, which makes sense because you would expect the core denotation of the word to be the same. Lockdown is still a lockdown, and everyone seems to agree about the core meaning. But what's interesting is that we can then find words like maskers, vaxxers, vax, vax, masker, that are clearly not strictly related to lockdown, but they seem to be in this community. Now, going beyond this analysis and basically building on top of this analysis, in the next step here now, we look into the biggest discrepancies in semantic neighbors of lockdown between both subreddits. So again, we have coronavirus on the left and lockdown skepticism on the right. But now what we've done is we've looked at full vocabulary and we've investigated out of all the semantic neighbors of lockdown, which ones are regarded as significantly more similar in the coronavirus community as compared to the lockdown skepticism community. So on the right-hand side, you see the semantic neighbors for lockdown in lockdown skepticism. And the first word on the list is vaxxers. And it ends up on top of this list because it is the form vaxxers is considered to be semantically close to lockdown, only with a cosine distance of 0.17 in the coronavirus community. So people don't associate it very strongly with lockdown, but it shows a very high similarity among the lockdown skepticism community. And this results in a big difference between the ranking in both communities. The same applies to masker, vax, maskers, vaxer. So we can see the same pattern coming up. In addition, I've highlighted two adjectives here, ethical and misguided, which clearly show the attitude of the people in this community towards the term lockdown. Now, I have one last case study for our social semantic variation for you. So here I'm analyzing the nearest neighbors for the term vaccine, but now I'm not comparing coronavirus to lockdown skepticism again, but this time I'm comparing it to the model for the subreddit conspiracy. And what we can see here is, again, more general terms and more neutral terms in the coronavirus subreddit. And if we look at the nearest neighbors for vaccine on the right-hand side, it's pretty interesting that most of these terms are actually not neutral at all, quite the opposite. So SIDS, for example, refers to the sudden infant death syndrome, which was claimed to be a big risk among the vaccine. The Neuralink is Elon Musk's brain implant company, and there are conspiracies around how that's related to the COVID pandemic. And related to this microchipping, this is a set of clearly conspiracy-related terms. And then we also find some words that signal the general attitude of people towards the vaccine. So forcefully probably indicates that many aren't happy to take the vaccine. Mandated as well. There seems to be some doubt about the efficacy of the vaccine as an untested, and about certain potential side effects like dysphoria. So all in all, it seems that we have a pretty vaccine skeptic and conspiracy related semantic representation in this community, which is what we would suspect. And therefore, the model does seem to capture some social semantic variation. Now, to sum up, dealing with neologisms here, and the classic case of neologisms is still formal neologisms. And if there's a new form, there's not too much doubt if it's successful, whether this is a new word. The thing with semantic neologisms like this is that this is much trickier. So are we dealing with new words here? Or are these just different kinds of uses? This is one example from the OED. Here are a couple of other examples. So the easiest case is if we have lexical innovation and these new forms become conventional, but they're formal neologisms like PPE and infodemic, then they usually get a new entry if they become conventional. But in the other cases, if there's new uses of a word, as with self-isolation, or if there's new senses of words, as in social distancing, or if there are new meanings, as in frontline worker, for which I showed you the collocation analysis, then it's an open question how dictionaries should deal with this. What we would like to show in this talk is that there are computational methods which could be useful for lexicography. Finally, to conclude, so we saw that COVID has triggered a high degree of lexical innovation. And previous work has shown that the pandemic has introduced many formal neologisms that are related to the pandemic. But what we try to show here is that we also observe considerable meaning change in existing lexemes. And lastly, we've investigated social semantic variation, and we saw that there are quite interesting differences in the semantic representations of certain words, like lockdown or vaccine, between communities. And this is particularly interesting in the current socio-political climate, where we see a lot of social fragmentation and polarization, especially on social media. And this is a promising area for future research. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.